Canadian man who worked with aid agencies in Ukraine is reported dead following a rocket attack. Global Affairs Canada is confirming the death, but not the identity of the man. However, Road to Relief says his name was Anthony Ihnat. The NGO says he was in a vehicle driving toward Bakhmut when it took a direct hit, flipped over, and caught fire. Ihnat also worked with Paracrew Humanitarian Aid and Brave to Rebuild, which says he was 58 years old. For more, we are joined now by George Beebe. He's director of the Grand Strategy at the U.S. think tank, the Quincy Institute, and a former director of the CIA's Russia analysis. Mr. Beebe, thank you for making time for us, sir.
Thanks, Natasha.
Mr. Beebe, before we talk about what happened at the G20 and the language in that summit, I wonder if I could get your reaction to this news that a Canadian citizen has died while working in Ukraine. And I wonder, if you were here to advise our government, what should the Canadian response be to his death and to the ongoing battle in Ukraine?
Well, this is obviously a humanitarian tragedy anytime something like this happens. And certainly all of the people involved in humanitarian relief are greatly courageous to put their lives at risk in order to deliver humanitarian aid. The real question on how to respond to this comes down to an assessment as to whether the Russians were deliberately targeting this convoy, these humanitarian workers. And at this point, I think it's too early to say. But so far in this war, there's not a lot of evidence that the Russians have attempted to attack Western aid workers in particular.
Someone might say, what does it matter? Even if it wasn't the intention, the outcome for Canada is the same. We've lost a citizen who was there doing humanitarian work.
Well, certainly it doesn't change the outcome, but it does change how the government might want to respond. If it's a deliberate act intending to target these officials, that calls for a much more aggressive response, I believe, than it would be if this were an accident.
What would be a potential aggressive response?
Well, that would probably be something that would be brought to the NATO Council. If it were determined that Russia were deliberately targeting NATO members and their citizens in this war, then NATO would have to deliberate over how best to respond to something like that.
Okay. Let's turn our attention now, sir, to the G20 and that declaration that doesn't name Russia directly. And for some of the participants found the language was too soft, that no country has the right to invade another sovereign nation state. What did you make of the language there?
Well, it's clearly a compromise. The United States, NATO, much of the West, in the past has adopted language condemning Russia for aggression, for violating Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, acquiring territory through aggression. And what the West has tried to do over the past year and a half since the invasion has been to isolate and punish Russia and to build support in the rest of the world for isolating and condemning Russia. That hasn't gone particularly well. Outside of the West, most of the world, although it doesn't support Russia's invasion, doesn't want to get caught in the middle between Russia and the West on this. They prefer to adopt a position of neutrality, more or less. So these differences of opinion were contentious at this G20 meeting. And I think what resulted was the West realized that it would not be able to come up with a joint declaration that everyone would sign on to unless there was a compromise. And I think this was an artful compromise. It's one that condemned violations in general of territorial integrity, of attempting to seize another country's territory. But it did not single out Russia, and that allowed the Russians to sign on to this too. And I think that bodes well for the possibility of future compromises on this war in the interests of bringing the fighting to an end.
How so?
Well, I don't think this war is going to end on the battlefield. I don't think the Russians are capable of conquering all of Ukraine. And I think the recent Ukrainian counteroffensive is a sign that Ukraine also is not going to be able to drive Russian forces off of all Ukrainian territory. So if the fighting is going to end, there's going to have to be a compromise. Both sides are going to have to give a little. And what happened at the G20, I think, shows that that kind of thing may, in principle, be possible.
Let's talk about some other nation states, again, that don't represent the West and this, what we would call the global South. So China also not taking a hard stand, certainly sometimes in lock and step with the Russians. And now we've got the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, saying that he's going to be visiting Russia in the coming days. And I wonder, between these two military powers supporting Moscow, where is Moscow in terms of this war? Are they gaining momentum? How are you seeing it?
Well, the war has gone through several different phases. I think last year the Ukrainians had seized the upper hand. Late last summer, early last fall, they were able to drive the Russians back in several parts of Ukrainian territory. The counteroffensive has not gone as the Ukrainians or their Western supporters had hoped. They've made some slight progress, but they're far short of being able to drive the Russians all the way back. And as a result, I think we're probably at a point where the Russians feel like they can play defense quite well. The big question now is, can the Russians shift from playing defense to offense? Rather than blunting the Ukrainian counteroffensive, can they actually seize large swaths of additional Ukrainian territory? That has yet to be demonstrated. But the North Korean support, the potential that North Korea may provide large number of artillery shells to Russia, means, I think, that the Russians feel confident that they can outlast Ukraine, that they can win a battle of attrition and wear down over time Ukraine's ability to supply its own forces and field an effective fighting force.
Okay. George Beebe, thank you so much for your time and for your insights, sir.
You're welcome.